So I heard that you're trying to start a podcast. If that's right, go ahead and grab a pen and a pencil because we are about to dive right in and I'm going to show you all the keys to success on how to start your podcast. Well, before we jump right in, my name is Alison, and if you are new here, go ahead and give me a subscribe and a thumbs up. I'm about to drop all the keys and help you get started on your podcast journey. So aside from YouTube, I do have a podcast which my best friend and I recently dropped last month on May 27, 2020, which is titled The Graduate Podcast. And on that podcast, we have it basically conversation style where we talk about current events, we talk about relationships, friendships, leaderships, of course we talk about education, and so many more topics. So definitely also support us. We are on all major streaming platforms and we drop episodes every Wednesday. So definitely gotta self-promote myself there. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. So you are watching this video because you are interested in starting your own podcast. So I have a couple of key ways to really get started on your journey aside from just brainstorming and believing in yourself that you can do it. So the first thing that you need to do when you're beginning your podcast is brainstorm. You need to think of, what do I want my podcast to be about? Who do I see as my audience? What is my niche? What do I want to talk about and how frequently do I want to talk about it? And then when you're even recording your podcast, there are a couple ways to do it. You can do interview style. You can have co-host style, which is the style that my best friend and I do. You can have solo. You can have it like a diary. You can have a production style podcast where basically it's like a storytelling and you're getting all the different senses that come with it. I do have a couple of favorite podcasts that I will drop for you all. I always am posting them on my Instagram. So if you follow me on Instagram, you know that I'm a little podcast junkie myself. So I think my favorite self-help podcast is going to be Therapy for Black Girls. So that is a podcast by a Black licensed mental health therapist where she basically talks about different ways that we can kind of take hold of our mental health. And she talks about it from all aspects, from like a business aspect, from a personal aspect, from a professional aspect. So definitely recommend Therapy for Black Girls. My favorite solo podcast is, without a doubt, is going to be the Anaya Ivy Podcast. So she is a New York girl just getting down to the nitty gritty about all things that us women experience. She talks about friendships. She talks about setting goals, manifesting your purpose, really coming into your womanhood. I definitely recommend that. She spits only the realest, the rawest, all of that. As far as like a business-esque podcast, I really like Brown Ambition, which is by two co-hosts. One of them is an entrepreneur and one of them is working in corporate America. And so they really get to bounce off completely different perspectives, talking about completely different things. So I definitely recommend that. As far as another self-help type of podcast, I would recommend Choose FI. So that is all about financial independence, about growing your pockets, about walking in your purpose, and really making smart decisions when it comes to your money. As far as a production type of podcast, I really like Dying for Sex. So that, in the first season, it explored two best friends. So one of them, unfortunately, has passed away from cancer, but they documented her journey and how she basically divorced her husband and went on a series of different sexual escapades to kind of feel alive, especially in the midst of her illness. So I think that one was really good as well. And then season 2, it talks about finding community and understanding like togetherness. So I think that one is really, really, really well put together. And then as far as like relationships, I really like Dead Ass with Khadeen and Devale. So they are two serial entrepreneurs. One of them used to play in the NFL and now they are both really diving into their acting career with 3 little boys that they're raising, and they talk about parenthood, they talk about relationships, they talk about really getting to that point as a family. And then I also really love The Love Hour. So that is another podcast that I definitely recommend. And they even have sectors within their podcast where they're talking about health, they talk about relationships, they talk about marriage, they talk about growing as a couple. So very, very, very similar to Deadass. Take a look at this. But yeah, so those are some of my podcast recommendations for you all, aside from the Graduate Podcast that talks about being a leader, being an entrepreneur, building, especially within your 20s. So yeah, again, basically my podcast is co-host style. So my best friend and I record from opposite ends of the country. We have not recorded a single episode together, so I can also share some of how we do that. So the thing with podcasts that has it growing in popularity is because it's so easy to do. It's very easy to just sit and record yourself talking. But one thing I do want to leave you all to consider is, especially when you do have a co-host and you're not doing it by yourself, you need to think of it like a business. Because with my best friend and I, we need to consider, when are we going to be recording? When are we going to be putting out episode? How do we allocate tasks? How much time and energy are we going to put into this? Because it needs to be equal. Otherwise, by the time that we do monetize our podcast, how are we going to be splitting those funds based off of who is doing X amount of work? You feel me? So those are some things that you really need to consider when you are starting your podcast, especially if you are starting with a co-host such as myself and Chelsea did. With podcasts, you really also need to think long term. There are people who do just a single season of a podcast, but as for Chelsea and I, we do see this going long term. We see ourselves hosting many, many seasons of the Graduate Podcast and carrying this on for at least a couple years. So again, just a couple things to consider before you start your podcast while you're in your brainstorming phase. So the second thing I want you to consider when beginning your podcast is equipment. So again, podcasting is very easy, especially as compared to YouTube, where you might need a more professional camera or professional lighting. Podcasting, really all you need is your microphone, your headphones, and either your computer or your laptop with the software that you're going to edit on. And even with that, for me personally, what has worked for me up until this point is recording on my phone. So basically, let me walk you through how I record my episodes. So I essentially will use my phone. I will go straight to my voice memo section, and I can easily record my audio. And I found that this is a way that's pretty crisp for me, and it works out very well for me. So I definitely recommend this. But again, you do need to consider that podcasting is only audio. So it will come time very, very soon where I do upgrade and invest into a better microphone. So the microphones that are typically recommended are the Blue Yeti. I've seen that all over the place. I have seen that it is just the best of the best. So I definitely recommend that. I believe it is marketed for $130. So again, you have to wait until you're ready to do that. But for right now, recording on my phone has given me really good quality audio. Another thing that you will need when recording your podcast is some headphones. Especially for Chelsea and I, when recording episodes of the Graduate Podcast, we typically record on FaceTime. So I'll jump into that a little bit later. But essentially, I have input coming in one way and my output goes into my phone. So in order for us to have completely separate tracks where you can hear each individual audio separately, if you see what I'm saying, it's important for us to have our audio separate so that she can have her own recording and I have my own recording. And then when it comes time to chop it up, then we can do that easily without having to like toggle with like one single recording. If you see what I'm saying? So I've seen people use Zoom, which I don't recommend, honestly, because again, if, for example, I'm speaking and Chelsea are speaking at the same time by accident, the audio will get a little bit screwed up. And so what we found is the easiest is if we FaceTime one another. So I'll FaceTime her on usually my laptop, and I'll have headphones in so I can hear and we can continue our conversation like to one another. And that way we're also able to like bounce off the energy and actually see one another. I feel like it's very hard when we're just like talking as if we're on the phone. I think that it's easier to get a little bit more animated when we can see each other. And then I do have my phone recording. So I can either record without like headphones attached. I typically don't. I'll typically just have the headphones into my laptop and record into my phone, and that works every time like gold. So the third part of starting your podcast is editing your podcast. So there are a couple different softwares out on the market to help you edit your podcast. I've seen a lot of YouTubers who do have podcasts use programs such as iMovie and Final Cut Pro to edit their software. However, I personally use GarageBand, and I think it is the easiest way to do it. It didn't take long for me to learn how to use GarageBand, and I feel like it's very user-friendly. So that is how I'm able to have like my audio, Chelsea's audio, and then like our intro and jingles and stuff like that play throughout our podcast. And then when we convert it into an MP3, then it's golden. And if you listen to our podcast, you will be able to kind of like hear what I'm talking about. You can hear each different element, and if we're overlapping, we can still hear one another. And so yeah. But ultimately, I would just recommend that you find a platform that works for you. Also, when editing a podcast, I think it is very important that you also find your editing style, as opposed to YouTube, where you kind of have to like chop everything up just a little bit more so that there's less delays and less lagging. A podcast is more conversational. At least mine is. It's more conversational. And so I edit just a little bit more loosely, and I allow for there to be a lot more like gaps in between conversations or while we're speaking, because that is like the natural flow of our conversation. And so for me, editing my podcast is really, really quick, because our conversation already naturally flows, and so there's very little that needs to get cut out. The fourth step about starting your podcast, especially before you launch, is your cover art and your jingle. So this is the perfect time to really get in contact with any of your friends who are artists, who are producers, and commission them to make your artwork. Unless you know how to do it yourself, which would be great, I think that's a great way to support your friends and support their businesses. So I will attach our producer who made our intro beat, and his name is Merle. He went to Howard University with me, so that is my dog. And he created our beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sound. So yeah, definitely recommend that. There are also platforms such as Upwork and Fiverr, where you can basically commission an individual to do the artwork for you. And through there, you can basically talk about what are you looking for, what do you want it to look like, etc., and then you pay them. So for our artwork, I believe we paid maybe $40, and then for our jingle, we paid $50. Especially if you are commissioning somebody to do the artwork for you, you will be looking to pay just a little bit more, but at the end of the day, it's worth it, and you're supporting somebody's hustle. Hey y'all, so as I'm editing, I forgot to mention something very important. So as far as your artwork, you want it to really encompass what your podcast is about. When Chelsea and I were deciding on our podcast title, we wanted to do something illustrated, especially because we are in different places, and so it would be easier to do like an animation illustration type of situation versus an actual picture, just because it's so hard for us to get into a place where we can actually take photos together. And so that's ultimately what we would like to do in the future. But you want to do a cover art that really represents your brand, represents you. Use some colors that stand out. Like, that is the first impression. So definitely consider that when you are creating your artwork for your podcast. And don't lowball. Literally do not lowball, because it will show. So yeah. So the fifth aspect is having your hosting platform. So I know a lot of people who use Anchor as their platform, but Chelsea and I personally use Buzzsprout. So Buzzsprout and Anchor are very, very similar in that you can upload your podcast and they will distribute it as soon as like you set up all your accounts for like the Apple Podcasts, the Spotify, Stitcher, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, all of those. So once you set up those accounts, which you can do through those websites, they will distribute it for you when you are ready. You can schedule your podcast. You can basically see all your analytics, who's listening, for how long, how many downloads, all of that good stuff. So you can track that on there. So the really cool thing about podcasting is that, very similar to YouTube and any other major platform, you can monetize it. It does take a little bit of time, and I will also encourage that you all don't rush it, because your time will be your time. That's just what I personally believe in. But with podcasts, it's typically for every 1,000 episodes, you can make between $15 and $50 per ad played per 1,000. So for example, if I have 5,000 listeners and I get an ad that pays me $20 per 1,000, that would be $100. So that's just something to consider. And Buzzsprout definitely provides those opportunities through all of their different affiliate programs. Number 6 would be creating a plan. So that's when you really want to think about, okay, how often am I going to be recording? Am I going to be recording in bulk, or am I going to be recording every week? Am I going to focus more on current events? Am I going to focus more on just general topics that can be played at any point? With my podcast, we've done like a mixture of both. We have podcasts that are more current event focused. We have some that kind of just drop on the fly. And we also have podcasts that are pre-recorded that are more general and applicable at any time of the year. Something else that you also want to consider is how often are you putting out your show. So I would recommend that if you're putting out a podcast, that you put it out either on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. We do our show on a Wednesday just because it's hump day, and I feel like a lot of people, especially as they're getting through the week, are looking for that pick-me-up and looking for something to really keep their mind going. And so we do our show on a Wednesday. So again, you just want to consider that, because on the weekend, people are really not sitting down to listen to a podcast. I feel like most people listen to podcasts on their way to and from work, or maybe on their work break. So that's just something to consider for you. Also, with creating a podcast, do not be afraid to have guests on your show. Don't be afraid to ask for guests, to solicit for guests, or to even ask to be on an individual's podcast. I think that if you have something valuable to say, then go ahead and say it. And so the last thing that I want to touch on before we wrap up this video is marketing. So with podcasts, I will say that the algorithm is a little bit funky, and that oftentimes, unless you are on the top charts, it is very hard to find another podcast. So marketing yourself is essential. So things that we do to market our podcast is we have a Twitter, which is TGP Starts Now, if you want to follow us. We have our Instagram, which we're the most active on. And so on there we have shareable content, things that are applicable, and things that follow our theme of the conversation for that week. We also try to keep a nice aesthetic so that it is easy to follow along with if you don't follow the podcast. And then we also do have a Facebook group, which we are in the process of really building up and creating a community of individuals who are like-minded, who need a safe space to just kind of talk about some of the things that we talk about, really dive into a lot more personal things. So I think those are some of the best ways to really market your podcast. Aside from having like your own personal Instagram page where you post about it, having pages dedicated for that podcast, especially if you see yourself being in the podcast game for the long haul and really growing in that, I think that's definitely something that you should consider. And something else that I see us doing possibly later on in the future is adding our podcast to YouTube. I feel like on YouTube they have a slightly better algorithm where they're able to catch like key phrases and keywords a little bit better, and that way people can find our podcast and eventually narrow it into Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever platform they use to listen to podcasts. But in the meantime, I think it would be a great way to really further market that podcast and just simply do it. Just have like the podcast cover and just the audio playing. Very, very simple. So I think that is a great way to do it. Well, I hope that this video was helpful for any of you all who are on your way to beginning your own podcast. If you have any questions at all, feel free to DM my personal Instagram or DM at The Graduate Podcast. That is our podcast Instagram. So definitely support, show love. You know, I thought we was on this wave of supporting Black businesses, so this counts. Supporting my YouTube counts, all that. Support Black, okay? Well, without further ado, I hope that you all have an amazing rest of your day, and I will talk to you in my next video.